Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? This is the third installment in the two weapon fighting series where I'm going to go over the little system that I came up with. Just to recap on the other systems though, Pathfinder doesn't do so great. It's a little too underpowered. Second edition is way too overpowered, and first edition is okay. It's not that bad. The thing is though, like when you start using big heavy penalties like they do in Pathfinder, a lot of times you're just not going to hit your opponents. You're going to need very high rolls, and you're not going to get them because, we're talking about the natural rolls you would need to hit something with your longsword. So that's the highest you're going to be able to roll. Period. So it's tough when you're using that kind of a system. But when you're using something like second edition, you're going to be hitting awful frequently, and you're going to be doing a heck of a lot more damage than him. So there's got to be a good middle road. And first edition is a pretty good middle road, but I figured, let me see what else I can come up with and incorporate some of these other ideas. So the ideas I came up with was this. I'm going to let you use daggers, short swords, and long swords in various combinations with different penalties. So if you're using the standard D8, D4, AD&D combination, you're going to have that -2, -4 penalty. If you're using two short swords, so they're two D6 weapons, you're going to get a -2, -6 penalty to hit. If you're using a long sword and a short sword, so it's a D8 and a D6 weapon, now your penalties are going to be -4, -6. And if you use two long swords, your penalties are going to be -4, -8. Now if you take some kind of specialization in the two weapon fighting style, now your penalties aren't going to be as bad. With the longsword and dagger, you're going to have your penalties of 0, -2. With the two short swords, the two D6 weapons, your penalties will be 0, -4. If you have the longsword and the short sword, the D8 and the D6 weapon, your penalties will be -2, -4. And if you have the two longswords, the two D8 weapons, your penalties are still going to be pretty high at -2, -6. Now, because of all the dexterity and ambidexterity that might be able to modify that, I figure there should be some minimum penalties you should get on these various weapon combinations where you just can't get any lower. So for the standard D8, D4, longsword, and dagger, I figure those would be 0, 0. We'll go with the original game. If you're using two short swords, those minimum penalties should be 0, -1. If you're using the longsword and the short sword, then those penalties should be 0, -2 at the bottom. And if you're using the two long swords, the two D8 weapons, your minimum penalties should be 0, -3. So how do these stack up mathematically compared to the other games? Well, if you've got the standard -2, -4 penalty with the longsword and the dagger, you're going to hit more often than the guy with a single longsword when he needs a natural roll of 14 or less. And you're going to hit things about 90% of the time that he does on average over all the various natural rolls needed. You're going to start doing better damage per round when he needs a roll of 13 or less. And your average damage per round compared to him is going to be 96%. So, it can be higher or lower, but that's the average. Now, if you've got the two short swords and you're doing -2, -6, you're going to start hitting things better on when he needs a roll of 11 or less. But you're going to be hitting things on average 81% of the time that he does. Your damage per round is going to get better when he needs a 9 or less, so, pretty low. And you're going to be doing an average damage per round of 81% of what he would. Now, if you've got the -4, -6 penalty for using the long sword and the short sword, so a D8 and a D6 weapon, you're going to start hitting things better when he needs a natural roll of 6 or less, so not very good. Your average to hit is going to be 66% of his over all the various armor classes. Your damage per round is also going to get better on a 9, and you're going to be doing 77% of the damage that he does overall. Now, if you have the -4, -8 penalty for the two long swords, you are never, ever going to hit better than he does in terms of to-hit rolls. You're going to hit things 59% of the time that the guy with a single sword does. When he needs a natural roll of 9 or less, you're actually going to be doing some better damage per round. But on average, your damage per round compared to him is going to be 74%. Now, you get specialized in these weapons, so there's different figures. You've got the 0, -2 penalty for the standard D8, D4, longsword, and dagger. At a roll of 18 that he would need, you're going to start doing better on both your to-hit roll and damage. You're going to be hitting 26% on average more often than he does, and 38% more damage than he does you'll be dishing out. If you have the 0, -4 penalty for using the two short swords, the two D6 weapons, then at a roll of 16 that he would need, you're going to start hitting more often, but you're going to be hitting on average 15% more of the time than he does. You're going to be doing better damage per round than he does if he needs a natural roll of 15 or less, and you're going to be doing 16% more damage on average than he does. If you have the -2, -4 penalty for the long sword and the short sword, the D8 and the D6 weapon, At a roll of 15 that he, 14 rather, that he would need, you're going to start hitting more often. However, on average, you're going to only be hitting 90% of the time that he does over the various armor classes. Your damage per round is also going to get better when he needs a natural roll of 14 or better, but you're only going to be doing on average 7% more damage. And if you got that -2, -6 modifier for the two longswords, the 2d8 weapons, when you're specialized, you're going to start hitting more frequently than he does when he is 11, but you're still only going to be hitting 81% of the time that he does overall. When his when he needs a natural roll of 12, you're going to be doing better damage per round, but on average you're only going to be doing 4% more damage than he does. So it's still not that overpowered. Now, of course, people are going to be having high dexterity, so we got to look at, what these minimum numbers for these various things are going to be. So we got 0, 0, the minimum number you can have for a longsword and a dagger. Obviously, at that point, on a natural roll of 20, you're going to be hitting more often and be doing more damage per round. You're going to be hitting 47% more of the time, and you'll be doing 55% more damage than he does. So that's a little bit higher than the top, in D&D's or AD&D, where you're using the longsword and the dagger. But of course, you're doing pretty well at this point, and that's what second edition would have you do with the ambidexterity and all that stuff. When you use 0, -1, the least possible penalties you could get for using the two short swords, the 2d6 weapons, on a natural roll of 19 needed by him, you're going to be doing, or less, you're going to be doing better in your to-hit rolls and better in your damage. You're going to hit things 34% more often than he does, and you're going to be doing 41% more damage than he does. If you got the 0, -2 penalty, so you're using the long sword and the short sword, the d8 and the d6 weapon, on a natural roll of 18 that he needs, you're going to be hitting more frequently and doing more damage than he does on average. But overall, you're going to be hitting things 26% more frequently than this guy does with a single longsword, and you're going to be doing 53% more damage. And finally, if you've got that 0, -3 penalty for the two longswords, the 2d8 weapons, and a natural roll of 17 that he needs to hit something, you're going to be doing better at your to hit and to your damage. And you're going to be doing, you're going to be hitting things 20% more often than he does, and you're going to be doing 58% more damage than he does. This gets a little high at the very high end, but not everybody's going to have 18 dexterity, and not everybody's going to be specialized in these weapons. So I think this is a pretty usable system. It lets you use all the various sizes of weapons right from the get-go, and I think it's fair. You should have some kind of benefit for using two weapons, and at the same time, you should be able to, hopefully hit things, on a frequent basis. Unless you're using two really large weapons until you get good at it and until you have a good dexterity or whatever. But I think it's cool to give people some options and just not just say, well, you have to use a dagger or nothing else, or now you're going to be super specialized and have this long sword where you can just hit everything at will and be like, just some kind of blade machine. But, at the same time, I don't want it so draconian like Pathfinder, where it never, ever, ever makes sense to use two weapons. So that's the system I'm toying with, and thanks for sticking with me throughout this entire series.